well, so unbelievable. It feels like fiction. You've got this kid, a real hellraiser, getting into trouble.
Right. Bullied, kind of a delinquent.
Exactly. And then he becomes an Olympic runner. Then he's a WWII airman, survives this horrific plane crash, spends 47 days lost at sea in, like, shark-infested waters, only to get captured and thrown into a brutal POW camp.
It's an almost impossible sequence of events.
And believe it or not, that's still just scratching the surface. So our deep dive today is all about Louis Zamperini. We're pulling from Laura Hillenbrand's amazing book, Unbroken, the film, and a bunch of related articles and research.
Yeah, there's a lot out there on him.
Our mission really is to boil it all down, to find those key insights, the most surprising bits. We're looking at his journey, obviously, but also trying to understand these bigger ideas. Resilience, trauma, and forgiveness, which is a huge part of his story later on.
Absolutely. And the historical context, too.
Definitely. So let's jump in.
What's so striking about Zamperini, I think, is where he started. It wasn't, the typical path for a hero.
Not at all.
The sources paint this picture of a really difficult childhood. He was picked on, he was rebellious, getting close to, delinquency.
Yeah.
But then his older brother, Pete, stepped in.
Yeah.
And he saw something, maybe that defiant energy, and channeled it into running, track and field. And that simple act, that guidance, it completely shifted his path from heading towards trouble to competing in the 1936 Berlin Olympics.
Wow. That's incredible. It really shows you the power of just one person believing in you, doesn't it?
It really does. A pivotal moment.
But then, like you said, history steps in. World War II, Zamperini enlists, becomes an airman, and his story takes this almost mythological turn.
Right. The plane crash. Horrific. Out in the Pacific.
Yeah.
8 of the 11 crew members died instantly.
Just devastating.
Yet Louis and 2 others, Russell Phillips, Phil, and Francis McNamara, they survived the crash itself.
Which is a miracle in itself.
Absolutely. But then they're adrift for 47 days in a small life raft. They're dealing with no food, no water, constant sun.
And sharks. The sources talk about constant shark attacks.
Constant sharks. And even, unbelievably, getting strafed, shot at by a Japanese bomber while they were helpless in the raft.
It's hard to even picture that level of endurance. 47 days.
And you think, okay, that must be the climax of the ordeal. But it wasn't.
No.
That struggle at sea was just the prelude. They get captured by the Japanese Navy.
And that leads to 2 years in POW camps. Brutal camps.
Extremely brutal. And in these camps, Zamperini becomes a particular target for one notoriously cruel guard, Mutsuhiro Watanabe, known as the Bird.
Bird deer.
Yeah, the book details that obsessive cruelty. It really pushed him to the absolute limit.
It did, which brings up the central question, really. How does someone endure that? What allows a person not just to survive, but to remain fundamentally themselves?
Exactly, because the story doesn't end with liberation either. He comes home, and the war is still very much with him. Severe PTSD. Right. Consumed by rage, especially towards the Bird. He was obsessed with revenge.
Understandably, perhaps. But what's so remarkable is the final act of his story, this journey towards forgiveness, towards service, towards finding some kind of peace. It's a really profound transformation.
It truly is, from the depths of trauma to something else entirely.
So, okay, let's unpack that. What kept him going? What kept him unbroken? The sources point to a few key things, starting with his mindset. It seems like he had this elite mental game.
Absolutely. One really fascinating technique they used both on the raft and later in the camps was mental imagery, particularly around food.
Food? How did that work?
Well, they would describe meals in minute detail, like they'd talk about hearing the eggs cracking, the sound of the whisk, really trying to experience it mentally.
Wow. To combat starvation.
Partly, yes.
Okay.
It was a way to trick the brain, maybe to feel less deprived, but it's also about mental discipline, keeping the mind sharp, focused, creating an internal reality when the external one was just unbearable.
That makes sense. It connects to that Viktor Frankl idea, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That you can take everything from a person.
Everything. Their health, their freedom. You can beat them, starve them.
But you can't take their will.
Exactly. Frankl said, attitude is the last of the human freedoms.
Yeah.
In those moments where you have absolutely zero control over your circumstances, you can just choose how you respond internally. That choice, that assertion of will, is incredibly powerful. It's defiance.
That's a really profound point. Attitude is the last freedom. And it reminds me of that advice his brother Pete gave him way back when he was running track.
Ah, yes. If you can take it, you can make it.
Yeah. That simple phrase became this kind of lifeline for him, didn't it? Through everything.
It absolutely did. It speaks to that idea of endurance, of pushing past what you think your limits are.
But does that kind of extreme toughness, does it have a downside later?
Oh, definitely. And we'll touch on the PTSD more, but purely for survival in that moment, that mantra was vital. And here's something else the sources mention, which might seem odd.
What's that?
The routines. Even in the POW camps, these incredibly harsh, imposed routines, they actually helped.
Really?
They provided structure, a constant, as one source puts it, in the middle of all that chaos and adversity. Humans crave order, even if it's imposed, sometimes. It gave them something predictable in an unpredictable hell.
Like a mental anchor.
Sort of. And it ties into another survival strategy, focusing on small victories. Not the overwhelming, how will I survive years of this, but just getting through the next hour, surviving the now.
Like that next 200 feet idea you mentioned.
Exactly that analogy. Just focus on the immediate step, the next small challenge. You do that enough times, and cumulatively, you make it through the bigger ordeal. It breaks it down.
That's such a practical takeaway. It's not about being superhuman. It's about tackling the micro moments. And what about self-respect? Louis apparently said later, if they feel like giving up, then they don't have any respect for themselves.
Right. He felt that overcoming adversity, proving to yourself that you can take it, builds this inner toughness, this self-respect. His whole life becomes this kind of, compared to what? Benchmark. It shows you maybe that we're all capable of more than we realize.
So mindset was huge. But it wasn't just mindset, right? There were practical things too.
Definitely. External factors were critical. Hillenbrand makes a big point about his Boy Scout training.
Boy Scouts, really?
Yeah, specific skills he learned years before. Things like basic first aid.
Which he used on Phil after the crash.
Saved his life, probably. Also, improvising tools like making a makeshift knife from parts of a signaling mirror, knowing how to navigate by the stars, signaling techniques, even not tying for escape plans later.
Wow, be prepared indeed. Those skills learned in childhood became actual lifesavers decades later.
It's a great point about the value of just practical knowledge, foundational stuff.
And it circles back to sports too, doesn't it? Running gave him focus, purpose. It was a vehicle that changes lives, as one source put it.
Absolutely. And Pete's role in pushing him towards running highlights that other critical factor, social connection, having someone in your corner.
Yeah, Pete was vital early on, but what about later in the camps? How did connection work there?
Even in captivity, that need for connection found a way. The POWs developed these secret tap codes.
To communicate between cells.
Exactly. To share information, offer support, maintain morale, even establish sort of moral guidelines for behavior within the group. It built solidarity.
That's incredible ingenuity under pressure.
It is. And the research we looked at backs this up strongly. Social support is consistently shown to be a major buffer against stress and trauma. It makes a huge difference in resilience. We really are wired for connection.
So we've got mindset, practical skills, social connection. What else? There seems to be this element of sheer optimism and dignity too.
Yes, definitely. On the raft, you see that contrast. Louis and Phil maintain this stubborn optimism, while Mac initially succumbed to pessimism.
Although Mac did redeem himself later, fighting off sharks.
He did, which is another story in itself. But Louis also had this deep, almost mystical belief in miracles. He felt divine intervention saved him multiple times from the plane crash, from the bomber's bullets. He even had visions.
And that incredible detail about refusing cannibalism despite being adrift for 47 days and losing half their body weight.
A profound act of preserving dignity, of holding on to their humanity in the most extreme circumstances.
And that dignity carried through to the camps. His refusal to read Japanese propaganda over the radio.
Even when they offered him comfort. A relatively easy life compared to the other POWs.
Right. He knew they wanted to use him, his Olympian status, to demoralize the U.S.
He understood it was psychological warfare. Refusing was an act of defiance, protecting his own integrity and, by extension, his country's, even at immense personal risk. It showed that even when physically broken, his spirit, his dignity, remained his own.
Okay, so he survives all this, makes it home. But the war isn't over internally, is it? The sources are really clear about the PTSD.
Not at all. The scars were deep and lasted for years, decades, really. Trauma has this incredibly long shadow.
And there's actual research on WWII POWs that backs this up quite starkly.
There is. One study is particularly sobering. It found that 16.6% of former WWII POWs still met the clinical criteria for PTSD 65 years after captivity.
65 years later, that's staggering. That's a lifetime carrying that burden.
It really puts it in perspective. And interestingly, the study found a significant difference based on where they were held captive.
How so?
POWs in the Pacific Theater, like Zamperini, had PTSD rates 3 times higher, around 34% compared to those held in Europe, which was about 12%.
3 times higher. Why such a difference?
It likely reflects the particularly brutal conditions, the systematic cruelty, the starvation, the lack of adherence to Geneva Conventions in many Japanese camps. These Pacific POWs also reported more flashbacks and intrusive memories later in life, sometimes worsening after retirement.
So the trauma didn't necessarily fade, it sometimes resurfaced more strongly.
Exactly. Which really underscores that resilience isn't about not being scarred. It's about how you carry those scars.
Does the research give any clues about what fosters that resilience? Why some people cope better than others?
It suggests a mix of factors. Personality seems to play a role. Traits like defiance, optimism, maybe even a bit of risk-taking. There might be genetic links there too.
Okay.
Upbringing matters. There's this idea of stress inoculation. Experiencing and overcoming manageable challenges in childhood can build resilience, sort of like a vaccine. This contrasts with, say, overly protective parenting.
Right, the helicopter parenting idea.
Then there's social support. Again, absolutely crucial. Having people like Pete and later Louis' wife Cynthia who provide that buffer. Biologically, things like certain hormones, neuropeptide Y, as mentioned, might help dissipate stress, but the genetics are still pretty murky. And finally, coping mechanisms developed later, like exercise running for Louis or mindfulness techniques, learning to observe thoughts without being consumed by them.
So it's really a combination of nature, nurture, support, and coping strategies.
Pretty much. It's not one single thing, but this dynamic interplay.
Which brings us to maybe the most remarkable part of his post-war journey, forgiveness. Because initially, he wasn't forgiving at all. He was consumed by rage.
Utterly consumed.
Yeah.
Especially towards the bird. Hillenbrand quotes him thinking, "I am still a man." He was going to kill the bird. Revenge became his new quest, replacing the Olympics he'd lost.
That level of hatred must have been its own kind of prison.
Absolutely. It was destroying him from the inside. But then came this turning point. He went to a Billy Graham crusade, initially very reluctantly, dragged there by his wife.
Right, and something clicked.
Something profound happened. He had this powerful religious experience. He remembered the promises he'd made to God while adrift on the raft, the moments he felt saved by divine intervention. It all sort of coalesced for him.
And this wasn't just a fleeting feeling, it led to real change.
According to the sources, yes. He had this realization that his anger, his need for revenge, was actually causing him the most pain. It was keeping him chained to the past, to his tormentor. And in that moment, he decided to let it go, to forgive the bird. Not for the bird's sake necessarily, but for his own.
And the effect was immediate.
Reportedly, yes. The nightmares, the flashbacks that had plagued him for years, they stopped. He described feeling this sense of compassion, forgiveness, beautiful and effortless and complete.
Wow. Laura Hillenbrand reflects on this too, right? About anger being understandable but corrosive.
Yes, she points out that holding on to bitterness keeps you chained to the person who hurt you. Forgiveness for Louis was the key to finally restoring his own sense of dignity and freeing himself.
It's such a powerful lesson in the personal benefit of forgiveness. But what happened to the bird, Watanabe? Did he ever seek forgiveness or redemption?
No. Quite the opposite, according to the sources. He became a successful businessman after the war, denied most of the atrocities, and even refused to meet Louis years later when Louis traveled to Japan, specifically hoping to offer forgiveness in person.
So he never found that peace?
It seems not. The sources suggest he missed out on that inner fulfillment and serenity that can come from confronting the past and making amends. A very different path.
It's important to remember, too, the broader context of all this, the sheer danger these WWII airmen faced.
Oh, absolutely. The statistics are mind-boggling. A 50% chance of being killed during a combat tour. Tens of thousands died just in training or non-combat accidents, let alone in battle.
Puts Louis' survival odds in even starker relief.
It really does. And this context, this history, is also why stories like Unbroken can be, well, contentious.
Right. The sources mentioned the reaction in Japan wasn't universally positive.
No, it stirred resentment in some circles. There are differing historical narratives at play. Some conservative groups in Japan actively deny or minimize wartime atrocities, things like the rape of Nanking, Unit 731's experiments, the comfort women issue.
And they see depictions like those in Unbroken as unfair, or even as anti-Japanese propaganda.
Exactly. It's crucial, though, that we note the sources also present counterpoints. Not everyone in Japan feels this way. Some acknowledge the past and see value in remembering. Official government apologies for wartime actions do exist.
It's a really complex tapestry of memory, national identity, and historical interpretation. We're just trying to convey what the sources report on these differing views, not endorse any one side.
Precisely. The sources also touch on the extremely sensitive issue of the atomic bombs. There was apparently a kill-all order for POWs that might have been carried out if the bombs hadn't ended the war so abruptly.
Which adds another layer to the debate about whether the bombs were necessary or a war crime.
And how many in Japan view themselves as victims of the war's end? It highlights the deep challenges of reconciling national narratives and achieving collective atonement. History is rarely simple or universally agreed upon.
Digging through all this, something really striking emerged about the author herself, Laura Hillenbrand. There's this sort of parallel story of resilience.
Her own story is quite remarkable, yes. She's battled severe chronic fatigue syndrome, myalgic encephalomyelitis since she was just 19.
Which left her largely housebound for decades. How did she even manage to write books like Seabiscuit and Unbroken with such incredible detail?
Primarily from home. Exhaustive research using old newspapers, documents, and crucially, hundreds of hours of phone interviews. But she described it as more than just research. It was a way to escape her physical limitations.
She called it vicarious living, right?
Exactly. She said, "I'm looking for a way out of here. It was a beautiful thing to ride Seabiscuit in my imagination, and it's just fantastic to be there alongside Louis as he's breaking the NCAA mile record." Writing became her way to travel, to experience these lives.
That's incredibly poignant. And there was a connection with Louis himself.
A mutual one. Apparently, Louis read an essay Hillenbrand wrote about her illness and felt a strong connection to her struggle, which helped him open up to her. And his optimism, in turn, inspired her.
In what way?
Well, she actually undertook this incredibly disciplined 2-year effort to overcome severe vertigo that was part of her condition. Slowly, painstakingly, she increased her tolerance for movement and travel.
Did it work?
It did. She eventually managed a cross-country trip and started doing things like riding horses and cycling again, activities she hadn't been able to do for decades. It's like her own unbroken journey, mirroring the spirit she wrote about.
Wow, that adds another whole layer to the story. So wrapping up this deep dive into Louis Zamperini and Unbroken, what are the big takeaways? We've seen this incredible capacity for human resilience, both mental and physical.
Absolutely. The power of mindset, the importance of connection, the role of dignity.
And that transformative, though incredibly difficult, journey towards forgiveness. How letting go of anger can be the ultimate act of self-liberation.
It really shows that surviving isn't just about enduring the hardship, but also about how you process it afterwards, how you find meaning and peace on the other side. But it also reminds us that the path is often incredibly long and difficult.
Unbroken is undeniably a story about the strength of the human spirit. But maybe the final thought to leave listeners with is this. As we reflect on Louis' individual triumph, and we consider all those different, sometimes clashing perspectives on the history he lived through, what responsibilities do we have now? As individuals, as societies? How do we confront difficult pasts? How do we try to reconcile these different narratives? And how do we actually work toward creating conditions for real peace and understanding moving forward?